Good evening and welcome back to the Somnorian. Settle in, dim the lights, and let the day slide off your shoulders. Tonight we're wandering into the medieval imagination, where the natural world was less a set of facts than a book of moral lessons, and the animals were the characters. There's nothing to study and nothing to remember. If you fall asleep before the weasel gives birth through its ear, it'll all still be here tomorrow. If these slow trips through history help you rest, a like sends them to a few more tired people, and you're welcome to subscribe if you'd like more. And tell me, before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? Leave it below. Now, let's talk about the beaver. A medieval scholar would tell you, with complete sincerity and a straight face, that the beaver is a deeply moral animal, and the proof is what it does when a hunter closes in. The beaver, they explained, is hunted for a substance in its testicles, called castoreum, a real secretion medieval medicine prized for treating headaches and fevers, and being a clever creature that understands exactly why it is being pursued, it will, when cornered and unable to outrun the dogs, bite off its own testicles, throw them to the hunter and escape. And should a second hunter come along later, the beaver reportedly rears up on its hind legs to demonstrate that it has nothing left worth taking and is allowed to go on its way. This is written down in serious books, readers' natural history. Now where does a belief like that come from? Because it did not come from anyone watching a beaver. It came, in large part, from a pun. The Latin for beaver is castor, and it sits close enough to castrar, to castrate, that the ancient writers who first recorded this, Aesop tells a version, and the Roman encyclopedist Pliny passed it along, reasoned backward from the word to the behaviour. The name sounded like self-castration. Castoreum came from that region of the animal, and so the story assembled itself out of language rather than observation. The medieval bestiarists inherited it whole, and then did the thing they did to everything, which was to find the sermon inside it. The beaver, they wrote, teaches us that a man who wishes to live chastely and reach God must cut away from himself all vice and every indecent act, and throw them in the face of the devil, who will then leave him alone. The beaver was no longer an animal. It was a self-help pamphlet with fur. To understand tonight properly, you have to understand what a bestiary actually was, because it's easy to picture a whimsical picture book and miss how seriously these were taken. A bestiary was a compendium of animals, real ones, exotic ones, and entirely imaginary ones, all shelved side by side with no dividing line. And it was one of the most popular and widely copied kinds of book in medieval Europe, especially in England from the 12th and 13th centuries. Its purpose was not zoology. It was moral and religious instruction, built on the conviction that God had filled creation with symbols, and that every creature carried a lesson for anyone clever enough to read it. The underlying source was a Greek text called the Physiologus, the Naturalist, compiled probably in Alexandria around the 2nd century, which spread across the medieval world in dozens of languages and became the backbone of nearly everything Europeans thought they knew about animals for 1,000 years. So when a beast in a bestiary does something impossible, remember, accuracy was never the point. The animal was a delivery system for a moral, and if the moral was good, the fact got to keep its job. Take the pelican, which medieval Christians adored above almost any other bird. The bestiary taught that the pelican is so devoted to its young that when the chicks grow and strike at their parents' faces, the parents strike back and kill them, and then, 3 days later, the mother pierces her own breast with her beak, lets her blood pour down over the dead chicks, and revives them. You do not need it spelled out why this bird was beloved. A parent dying to bring dead children back to life on the 3rd day was, to a medieval reader, a portrait of Christ so exact it barely needed a caption. The image became so standard that the pelican pecking its bleeding breast appears carved into church furniture and stained into windows across Europe, and it survives today in heraldry and even on the coat of arms of Louisiana. Pelicans, for the record, do not stab themselves. The myth may have grown from the way some pelicans rest their long bills against their chests, or from the reddish tinge certain species develop on the breast in breeding season. But the theology was perfect, and perfect theology has a way of outvoting an actual bird. The weasel gives us the ear. Medieval bestiaries held, on the authority of the ancients, that weasels conceive through the mouth and give birth through the ear, or, in the versions that couldn't quite agree, conceive through the ear and deliver through the mouth. The confusion itself is telling, because nobody arguing about which orifice does what had thought to simply go and look at a weasel, which suggests the fact lived entirely on the page, handed from copyist to copyist. and the bestiarists were ready with a lesson even here. Some, they wrote, hear the word of God gladly through the ear, but then, seduced by worldly desire, they let it out through the mouth and ignore it. The weasel's anatomy repurposed as a warning about people who nod along to a sermon and forget it the moment they leave the church. There was apparently no animal so strange that a moral couldn't be squeezed out of it. Then there is the hedgehog, and the medieval hedgehog was a burglar. The bestiary describes it climbing grapevines, shaking the fruit to the ground, then rolling on its back over the fallen grapes so they impale on its spines, and trundling off to feed its babies with a full load of stolen fruit on its back. It's a wonderfully specific image, and completely wrong. Hedgehogs eat insects and small creatures, not grapes rolled onto their quills, but as a picture it was too good to lose, and the moral came ready-made. The hedgehog is the devil, stripping the vine of your soul's virtues and carrying them away, and the faithful are warned to guard their spiritual grapes. Once you notice the pattern, you start to see that the bestiary is barely about animals at all. It's a book about human vices and virtues that happens to be wearing a zoo as a costume. The lion opened most bestiaries, as the king of beasts should, and everything the lion did was made to point at God. Lion cubs, they wrote, are born dead and lie lifeless for 3 days until the father lion arrives and breathes on them or roars over them, at which point they come alive. Another 3-day resurrection. Another neat parallel to Christ that the bestiarists underlined with satisfaction. The lion was also said to sleep with its eyes open, watchful even in rest, and to erase its own tracks with its tail as it walked so hunters couldn't follow. Details that sound like folklore because they are, but which were catalogued as plainly as if someone had measured them. The lion sleeping with open eyes became a symbol of Christ watchful in the tomb, the erased tracks a symbol of divinity hidden from human understanding, and so the most familiar animal in the book was also one of the most thoroughly reimagined. Some entries were stranger, and some were simply monsters that had wandered in from the edges of geography and been filed under animals without comment. The bestiary describes the manticore, a beast with the face of a man, the body of a lion, 3 rows of teeth, and a tail that fires venomous spines, said to devour people whole. An import from Persian legend that Pliny had recorded centuries earlier and nobody thought to question. It describes the amphisbena, a serpent with a head at each end so it can roll in either direction, and the basilisk, a small serpent so venomous it could kill with a look and wither plants merely by passing over them, whose only weakness, conveniently, was the smell of a weasel. That last detail matters, because it shows how the whole system interlocked. The weasel that gave birth through its ear was also the creature you'd theoretically deploy against a basilisk, and the medieval reader met both on the same page with equal confidence, because both were simply what the book said, and the book was ancient, and ancient meant true. There's a particular pleasure in the entry for the barnacle goose, though we'll give that bird its own full night soon, because it sits at the exact seam between strange belief and extremely convenient belief. For now it's enough to note that the bestiary tradition was perfectly comfortable, claiming that certain geese were not born from eggs at all, but grew from timber soaking in seawater, dangling by their beaks from rotting logs, until they dropped off fully formed, and that this wasn't idle whimsy, but a claim with real consequences for what people were allowed to eat during fasting. The bestiary's errors, in other words, weren't sealed inside the library. They reached the dinner table. What ties all of it together, the self-castrating beaver, the self-stabbing pelican, the grape-thieving hedgehog, the resurrecting lion, is a way of seeing the world that we've almost entirely lost, and it's worth holding on to for a moment before sleep. To the medieval mind, an animal that behaved falsely but meant truly was not a failure. It was doing its real job. Creation was a second scripture, written by God in creatures instead of words, and the whole point of studying a beaver was not to learn about beavers, but to learn about yourself and your soul. The men copying these books by candlelight weren't stupid, and many of them were the most learned people of their age. They were simply reading the world for a different purpose than we do, asking every fox and phoenix and whale, not what are you, but what do you teach me? And when you go looking for a lesson hard enough, you will always, always find one, even in the improbable dignity of a cornered beaver rising onto its hind legs to show a hunter it has, regrettably, nothing left to give. Chapter 2. Barnacle Geese and the Great Lent Loophole. There is a goose called the barnacle goose, a real living bird, black and white, that still winters on the coasts of Britain and Ireland, and for several centuries a great many educated Europeans believed it grew from wood. The story ran like this. A piece of timber falls into the sea and begins to rot, and from the softening wood sprout small shells that cling by a kind of beak. Inside each shell a bird slowly forms, hanging by that beak from the log as it develops feathers, until at last it drops off and swims or flies away as a full-grown goose. No one had ever found the bird's nest, egg or breeding pair, because barnacle geese in fact breed far to the north in the Arctic, in Greenland and Svalbard, and simply vanish from British shores every spring. So, reasoning from that absence, medieval naturalists concluded the bird must reproduce by some route that didn't involve eggs at all, and the rotting driftwood route was the one the evidence seemed to favour, and they had, by their own lights, real evidence to look at. What people were actually finding were goose barnacles, the marine crustacean with a long fleshy stalk and pale, feathery filaments it waves out of its shell to feed. Cluster a colony of them on a piece of driftwood, look with a medieval eye and no notion that a crustacean and a bird are different kinds of thing, and the resemblance does real work. The dark shell looks like a folded head, the stalk like a neck, and those waving plumes look uncannily like the down of a half-formed bird. The very name preserves the tangle to this day. We still call the crustacean the goose barnacle, and the bird the barnacle goose, two creatures locked together in English by a mistake nobody ever fully undid. The man who put this belief on the map more than anyone was Gerald of Wales, a well-travelled and highly educated cleric who wrote a description of Ireland around 1187 called the Topographia Hibernica. Gerald reports the barnacle goose origin as plain natural history, describing the birds growing from fir timber in the sea, hanging by their beaks like seaweed from the wood. And he was not some credulous villager, but a Cambridge-adjacent scholar who had studied in Paris, which tells you how respectable this idea was. But Gerald also noticed the consequence that would make the goose famous, and here the story turns from strange to genuinely useful, because he complained about it. In parts of Ireland, he wrote, clergy were eating these birds during fasting periods, reasoning that since the geese were not born of flesh and had never been conceived the ordinary way, they were not meat, and could therefore be eaten on the fast days when meat was forbidden. To feel the weight of that loophole, you have to understand how much of the medieval year was spent not eating meat. The church required abstinence from the flesh of warm-blooded animals on a formidable number of days. All of Lent's 40 days, the weeks of Advent, most Fridays, various vigils and ember days, adding up, across the calendar, to something like a third of the year or more under strict reckoning. Fish was permitted, on the logic that creatures of the water belonged to a different order of creation and didn't count as flesh in the same way. So the pressing question for a hungry monk was always, which side of the line does this animal fall on? And the barnacle goose, conveniently, could be argued onto the fish side. It came from the sea, it grew on timber in the water, it was never born of a mother in the ordinary sense, and so a bird that plainly looked and tasted like a goose could be served on Good Friday with a clear conscience. The beauty of it, from a certain scheming angle, is that this wasn't cheating in the eyes of the people doing it. If you genuinely believed the goose grew from wood and had no flesh and blood parentage, then classifying it as not meat wasn't a dodge. It was simply correct zoology applied to church law. The premise was wrong, but the reasoning built on top of it was airtight, and that combination, a false fact supporting a perfectly logical conclusion, is the exact texture of medieval belief we keep running into. It's the loophole that isn't a loophole to the person using it, the tax shelter that feels like honest accounting because you sincerely misunderstand what a goose is. The church, to its credit, eventually noticed that a great many geese were being eaten under this reasoning and moved to shut it down, though it took a remarkably long time. The decisive blow came in 1215, when Pope Innocent III at the Fourth Lateran Council, the same sweeping council we'll meet again for other reasons, explicitly forbade the eating of barnacle geese during Lent. Crucially, he did not do this by declaring that the birds hatched from eggs. The science wasn't settled enough for that, and the folk belief was still widespread. Instead, he ruled that even if the geese did grow from wood as claimed, they nonetheless lived and fed like other birds, and so should be treated as flesh for the purposes of fasting. It's a wonderfully pragmatic piece of theology, the Pope declining to fight the barnacle myth head-on, and instead closing the loophole from the side, ruling that a thing that swims and honks and behaves like a goose can be forbidden like a goose no matter where you insist it came from. The barnacle goose was really only the most charismatic example of a much larger idea that underpinned the whole medieval understanding of life, which is spontaneous generation, the belief that living things could arise directly from non-living matter or from decaying matter without any parents at all. This was not a fringe superstition. It was mainstream natural philosophy inherited from Aristotle himself, who had taught that certain lower creatures were generated from mud, dew, rotting plants, and other lifeless material warmed by the sun. For roughly 2,000 years, from Aristotle down to the 17th century, this was simply the educated consensus on where a great deal of life came from, and it held up because, without a microscope and without the concept of eggs too small to see, the evidence genuinely seemed to support it everywhere you looked. Consider maggots, the most persuasive case of all. Leave meat out, and within a day or two it teems with maggots that appear to have come from nowhere. No eggs visible, no parent insect seen laying them, just rot turning spontaneously into wriggling life. To a medieval observer with no way to see a fly's tiny eggs, the conclusion that the corruption of the flesh itself bred the maggots wasn't lazy. It was the plain reading of the evidence. The truth that flies land, lay eggs invisible to the casual eye, and those eggs hatch, would not be demonstrated until 1668, when the Italian physician Francesco Redi covered jars of meat with gauze, showed that maggots appeared only where flies could reach the meat to lay, and quietly dismantled a belief that had stood since antiquity. The examples ran through every corner of medieval life. Mice, it was widely held, could be generated from grain and rags. A recipe passed down for centuries held that if you left dirty cloth in a container of wheat, mice would arise from the mixture, and since barns full of grain did reliably fill up with mice, the recipe seemed to work. Eels, whose breeding was a genuine mystery for millennia because they spawned far out in the Sargasso Sea and no one ever caught them reproducing in a river, were thought to be born from mud, or from the slime of other eels, or even from horsehairs that fell into water. Frogs and toads were believed to rain down from the sky, or emerge fully formed from riverbank mud after storms, which is roughly what it looks like when amphibians that were there all along suddenly become active after rain. Then there were bees, and the bee myth is the most striking of all because it was tied to a specific, repeatable, and completely wrong procedure. From antiquity through the Middle Ages, it was believed that a fresh swarm of bees could be generated from the carcass of a dead ox or bullock, a practice called begonia, and the method was written down in detail by no less than Virgil in the 4th book of the Georgics, one of the most admired poems in the entire Western canon. Beat a young bullock to death, seal it in a shed, let it rot in the warmth, and in time, it was said, bees would rise from the putrefying carcass to form a new hive. The belief probably rested on a real observation of something else entirely. Certain hoverflies and droneflies lay their eggs in rotting carcasses, and their offspring, striped yellow and black, look enough like bees to fool the eye. So people saw bee-like insects emerging from dead cattle, and Virgil's instructions, printed and copied and taught for well over 1,000 years, seemed to be confirmed by nature every time. What holds this whole night together, the goose on the log, the maggot in the meat, the bee in the ox, is a single missing piece of knowledge whose absence made all of it reasonable. Nobody could see eggs. Fly eggs, the microscopic seeds of things, the fact that an eel or a barnacle goose might travel thousands of miles to breed somewhere no European had followed it. All of that was invisible, and in a world where you cannot see the cause, the appearance of an effect from nowhere is not a mystery to be solved, but simply the way things are. The medieval naturalist looking at a maggoty joint of meat was not refusing to think. He was thinking hard and honestly about evidence that genuinely pointed the wrong way, and reaching the only conclusion the visible facts allowed. And in the specific case of the goose, he happened to reach a conclusion that let him eat roast fowl through Lent, which is either a triumph of the scientific method or the most delicious accident in the history of theology, depending on how hungry you were. Chapter 3. 4 fluids and a man made of zodiac signs. If you had walked into a physician's room anywhere in medieval Europe with a fever, a rash, or a black mood you couldn't shake, the doctor examining you was working from a single unifying theory that explained all of it, every illness, every temperament, every stage of life. And that theory was the 4 humours. The body, he believed, was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was the balance of the 4, Illness was one of them running to excess or falling short. It was elegant, it was total. It accounted for everything from a runny nose to a suicidal depression, and it was almost entirely wrong. But it held the Western medical mind in an unbroken grip for roughly 2,000 years, which is a longer run than most true ideas ever get. The system came down to the Middle Ages from the Greeks, specifically from Hippocrates in the 5th century BC, and then, decisively, from Galen of Pergamon, a Greek physician working in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD, who systematized humoral theory into a vast, internally consistent edifice. Galen wrote so much and so persuasively that his authority became nearly absolute. Medieval medicine was, to a startling degree, just Galen with footnotes, taught in the universities and rarely challenged, because to challenge Galen was to challenge the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years. And the theory's real genius, the reason it survived so long, was that it explained not just why you got sick, but who you were, folding personality, physiology, and the cosmos into one scheme where everything corresponded to everything else. Each humour was paired with 2 qualities drawn from the 4 elements, and this is where the system becomes a kind of beautiful machine. Blood was hot and wet, linked to air and the spring. Yellow bile was hot and dry, linked to fire and summer. Black bile was cold and dry, linked to earth and autumn. Phlegm was cold and wet, linked to water and winter. Your dominant humour set your temperament, and here we hit words you still use without knowing you're quoting a 2,000-year-old medical theory every time you open your mouth. A person with too much blood was sanguine, cheerful, ruddy, optimistic. Too much phlegm made you phlegmatic, calm, sluggish, unbothered. Too much yellow bile, choleric, quick-tempered, hot, aggressive. And too much black bile made you melancholic, sad, brooding, thoughtful. The very word melancholy is Greek for black bile, so that every time you describe a gloomy afternoon as melancholy, you are unknowingly diagnosing yourself with a surplus of a fluid that does not exist. Because the whole point was balance. The physician's job was to correct an excess, and the most direct way to remove an excess of blood was to remove some blood, which is how bloodletting became the single most common medical procedure in the Western world for well over a millennium. If you were feverish, flushed, agitated, too hot, too wet, too sanguine, the obvious remedy was to open a vein and let out the surplus until balance returned. It was used for fevers, for headaches, for inflammation, for madness, for nosebleeds, for practically anything, and it was performed on nearly everyone at some point, from peasants to popes, as routine maintenance as much as emergency treatment. The instrument was a small blade called a phleem or lancet. The usual site was a vein in the arm, and the practitioner would drain a measured quantity into a bowl, sometimes several ounces, sometimes alarmingly more, judging by the patient's pulse and pallor when to stop. The horror of bloodletting from our side of germ theory is that it was not merely useless but actively harmful in most of the cases where it was used. A feverish, weakened patient is very often precisely the person who can least afford to lose blood, and yet it persisted, because the theory was so complete that failure never disproved it. If the patient recovered, the bloodletting worked. If the patient died, the imbalance had simply been too severe, or too far gone, or some other humour was at fault. There was no result the system couldn't absorb, which is exactly what makes a wrong idea immortal. It kept its grip so long that George Washington, in 1799, well past the Middle Ages into the age of the American Republic, was drained of an estimated several pints of blood over the course of a single day as treatment for a throat infection, and died, having received the fully considered best medicine of his age, which was killing him. Who actually held the blade tells you a great deal about how medieval society ranked its healers, because the university-trained physician generally did not do the cutting himself. Surgery and bloodletting were manual, bloody work, considered beneath the dignity of the learned doctor who diagnosed and prescribed but kept his hands clean. The actual incisions were most often made by barber surgeons. Yes, barbers, the same men who cut hair and trimmed beards. This is not a coincidence or a joke. The barber's razor made him the man in the village with a sharp blade and a steady hand, so hair-cutting, tooth-pulling and vein-opening naturally bundled into one trade. The red and white striped barber's pole that still turns outside barbershops today is a direct survivor of this world. The red for blood, the white for the bandages or the tourniquet, the pole itself for the staff a patient gripped to make the veins in the arm stand out. Every barber pole you have ever walked past is a small monument to the days when your haircut and your bloodletting came from the same man. Bloodletting had a more specialised and considerably more unsettling cousin, which was leeching, the deliberate application of live medicinal leeches to draw blood from a specific spot, favoured when the physician wanted a gentler, more localised removal than a slashed vein provided. The leech, Hirudo medicinalis, was a genuine tool of the trade, placed on the skin to latch on and swell with blood before dropping off, and it was so central to the profession that leech became a common word for a doctor in Old and Middle English. A medical text could be called a leech book, and to be under a leech's care meant to be under a physician's. Leeches were used near the eyes, the gums, the temples, anywhere a lancet was too crude, and the practice was refined enough that practitioners debated how many to apply and where, treating the worm as a precision instrument. Now lay astrology on top of all this, because the medieval physician did not treat the body as a closed system. He treated it as a small mirror of the cosmos, wired directly to the movements of the stars and planets, so that when you fell ill was as important as where. This union of medicine and astrology was so complete that it had a name, astromathematics, and it was taught seriously in the great medical universities. The physicians of the age were expected to know the heavens, and many carried folding almanacs that let them calculate the positions of the planets at a patient's bedside. The core doctrine was that each sign of the zodiac governed a particular part of the human body. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck and throat, Gemini the arms and shoulders, and so on down the body, Leo the heart, Libra the kidneys and lower back, all the way to Pisces, which ruled the feet. The body was mapped, head to toe, onto the wheel of the sky. This mapping was drawn out in one of the most striking images in all of medieval medicine. The zodiac man, or Homo Signorum, a diagram of a naked figure standing with arms out, each region of his body labelled with the zodiac sign that ruled it. The symbols scattered across him from the ram at his skull to the fish at his feet. This wasn't decoration, it was a working clinical tool. The rule it encoded was that you should never perform surgery or bloodletting on a part of the body, while the moon was passing through the sign that governed that part, because the humours there would be in flux and the operation dangerous. If the moon was in Aries, you left the head alone. If it was in Pisces, you didn't cut the feet. A physician about to open a vein would first check the moon's position, consult his zodiac man, and possibly send you home to come back in 3 days when the heavens had moved into a safer configuration, a medical culture in which the answer to "should we operate today" depended partly on which constellation the moon happened to be visiting. The astrological reasoning reached the most intimate corners of care. Physicians timed the gathering and administering of herbs by planetary hours, believing each plant fell under the rulership of a planet and worked best when that planet was favourably placed. They practised uroscopy, the inspection of a patient's urine, held up to the light in a special flask called a macula, its colour, cloudiness, sediment and even taste read for signs of humoral imbalance. And the urine flask became such an emblem of the profession that it functioned as the medieval equivalent of a doctor's white coat, instantly identifying a physician in any painting. A doctor might diagnose you at a distance from a bottle of your urine carried to him by a servant. Cross-reference the diagnosis against your birth chart. Consult the moon before treating you, and prescribe a herb chosen for its planetary sympathy. An entire coherent workflow resting on premises that were, nearly top to bottom, false. And yet it would be a mistake, and against the whole spirit of these nights, to leave the medieval doctor as a fool draining blood by starlight, because within a wrong framework these people were often shrewd, careful clinicians. They took detailed case histories, observed the progress of diseases attentively, understood that diet, rest, fresh air and moderation genuinely affected health, and built up real practical knowledge of setting broken bones, dressing wounds, and easing pain with opium and other herbs that actually worked. Their theory of why the body did what it did was wrong in almost every particular, but their bedside habits of watching, recording, and adjusting were the seeds of something that would one day become real medicine. They were reasoning as ever, with total sincerity and considerable intelligence, from premises handed down by ancient authorities they had no reason to doubt, and the miracle is not that they got so much wrong, but that a physician could check the moon, inspect your urine, balance your bile, and still, now and then, actually make you better. Chapter 4. Let God decide. Trial by ordeal. Imagine you have been accused of theft in a village in the year 1050. There are no witnesses, no confession, and no way for anyone to know for certain whether you did it. And the court's solution to this problem is to heat a bar of iron until it glows, place it in your bare hands, and have you carry it 3 paces across the room. Your hands are then bound in cloth and sealed, and 3 days later a priest unwraps them. If the burns have festered, you are guilty and will hang. If they are healing cleanly, you are innocent and free to go. This was not mob violence or backroom cruelty. It was the formal, sanctioned legal procedure of much of early medieval Europe, conducted in church, blessed by a priest, and recorded as a legitimate verdict, a justice system that, when it ran out of evidence, turned the final decision over to God. The logic underneath the ordeal was perfectly coherent once you grant its central premise, which was that God actively intervened in human affairs and would not allow an innocent person to be unjustly condemned. If the truth was known only to God, then the sensible thing, the only thing really, was to create a situation dangerous enough that only divine intervention could produce a good outcome, and then read the result as his verdict. The whole apparatus rested on this single assumption, and it's worth sitting with how reasonable it felt to people who genuinely believed in a God who watched everything and cared about justice. If he was real and just and present, why wouldn't he reach down to spare the innocent hand from the hot iron? The ordeal wasn't a failure of reason. It was reason built faithfully on a premise about how the universe worked. The hot iron was one of the 2 great ordeals, and it came in grades of severity depending on how serious the accusation was. In the ordeal of the hot iron, the accused carried a heated iron bar, usually weighing about a pound for a set distance, commonly 9 feet or 3 paces. For graver charges, the iron might be doubled or tripled in weight. A close relative was the ordeal of the ploughshares, in which glowing iron ploughshares were laid on the ground, and the accused had to walk barefoot across them. A test famously said to have been demanded of Emma of Normandy, mother of Edward the Confessor, who according to a much later and probably legendary account walked over 9 red-hot ploughshares unharmed to prove her innocence. In every version the mechanism was the same. The injury was real and immediate, but the verdict came from how the wound healed over the following days, which meant the judgment hinged on the messy biology of infection in an age that understood nothing about bacteria. The other great ordeal used water, and it's split into 2 very different forms that are easy to confuse. The ordeal of hot water, or the cauldron, required the accused to plunge a bare arm into a pot of boiling water, sometimes up to the wrist, sometimes to the elbow for more serious accusations, to retrieve a stone or ring dropped to the bottom. The arm was then bound and inspected days later for the same signs of festering or healing. This was the scalding cousin of the hot iron, and it worked on identical principles. But the ordeal of cold water was something else entirely, and it is the one that would echo forward into the witch trials of the later centuries with such grim consequences. In the cold water ordeal, the accused was bound and lowered into a body of blessed water, and the reading was inverted from what instinct expects. If you sank, you were innocent, because the pure water had accepted you. If you floated, you were guilty, because the water, consecrated, holy, had rejected your body and refused to receive a person in a state of sin. Sit with the cruel arithmetic of that for a moment, because the cold water ordeal is where the whole system reveals its darkest edge. To be proven innocent, you had to sink, which is to say, you had to be pulled under the water and be seen to go down, and the innocent were meant to be hauled back up by a rope tied around them before they drowned, though the timing of that rescue was entirely in the hands of the men holding the rope. The test that cleared your name was the test that could kill you, and the test that saved your life from drowning was the one that condemned you to execution. This inverted logic, float, and you're a witch, sink, and you're innocent but possibly dead, would be revived enthusiastically for swimming, accused witches in the 16th and 17th centuries, long after the medieval church had abandoned ordeals, which is one of history's grimmer ironies. A method the medieval church eventually rejected as improper was resurrected by early modern communities who thought themselves more enlightened. Not every ordeal involved fire or water, and one of the strangest was reserved largely for the clergy, who had a professional interest in not having their hands burned off. This was the ordeal of the korsned, or the cursed morsel, a piece of bread or cheese, often about an ounce in weight, consecrated with a solemn prayer asking God to make it stick in the throat of the guilty and choke them. The accused had to swallow it, choke or gag, and you were guilty, get it down cleanly and you were cleared. It was gentler than gripping molten iron, which is presumably why it was favoured for priests and monks, and there is a persistent tradition, unverifiable but too good to leave out, that the powerful Anglo-Saxon Earl Godwin, father of the King Harold who would die at Hastings, choked to death on exactly such a morsel while protesting his innocence in a death at the royal table. Whether it happened or not, the story's survival tells you the corrent was real enough that people found it entirely plausible for a man to be struck down by a piece of God's bread. The single most important thing to understand about all of this, the thing that separates the ordeal from pure barbarism, is how tightly the church controlled it and how central the priest was to the whole event. An ordeal was a religious ceremony from beginning to end. The accused typically fasted and prayed for 3 days beforehand. The iron or the water was blessed with elaborate liturgies specifically written for the purpose, surviving in manuscripts as formal rites. The ceremony took place in or beside a church, often after Mass, and the priest presided over every stage from heating the iron to sealing the wound to pronouncing the verdict when the bandages came off. This was not folk superstition operating in the shadows. It was official ecclesiastical practice, embedded in law codes, with the machinery of the medieval church wrapped around it at every point. Which is exactly why, when the church changed its mind, the whole system could collapse almost overnight. And change its mind it did, in one of the more consequential decisions in medieval legal history, at the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, the same great council under Pope Innocent III that we met settling the fate of the Barnacle Goose. Among its many sweeping canons, the council forbade clergy from participating in ordeals, prohibiting priests from performing the blessings and rites that gave the ordeal its entire meaning and force. This was not framed as ordeals don't work, though there was growing intellectual unease about the theology of demanding that God perform a miracle on command, which some churchmen had come to see as effectively tempting or testing God, a serious sin. Whatever the precise mix of motives, the practical effect was immediate and devastating to the system. Without a priest to bless the iron and sanctify the water, the ordeal was just a man burning his hand for no reason, stripped of the divine sanction that made the result a verdict rather than an injury. The removal of the ordeal left a gaping hole in the legal systems of Europe, because for centuries it had been the standard method of resolving cases where evidence ran out, and courts suddenly needed something to put in its place, and what filled the gap in different regions would shape Western law for the next 800 years. In England, the vacuum was filled by an institution that had been developing alongside the ordeal, and now expanded to take its place: the jury, a body of local men who would weigh the facts and deliver a verdict themselves, human judgment stepping in where divine judgment had been withdrawn. It is a genuinely startling piece of history that the modern jury trial, the cornerstone of English and American criminal justice, the thing dramatised in 1,000 courtroom films, rose to prominence in significant part because in 1215 the Pope stopped letting priests bless hot iron, leaving England scrambling for a new way to decide guilt. On the European continent, the same vacuum was filled very differently, and considerably more darkly, by the revival of Roman law and its emphasis on confession as the highest form of proof, the so-called Queen of Proofs. If a confession was what a court most needed to convict, and there were no witnesses, then the pressure to obtain a confession grew intense, and the logical, terrible endpoint of that pressure was the systematic use of judicial torture to extract one. The disappearance of the ordeal, in other words, did not simply usher in a gentler, more rational age everywhere. On the continent, it helped open the door to the interrogation chamber, trading a system that asked God to reveal the truth through a burn for a system that asked the rack to produce the truth through pain. It is a sobering correction to the comfortable story of progress. The abandonment of one strange belief did not lead straight to enlightenment, but split into two roads, one running toward the jury box and the other toward the torturer's bench. There's a final wrinkle that makes the ordeal more human and less alien than it first appears, which is that the people running these ceremonies were not necessarily naive about what was happening, and there is real reason to think the ordeal often functioned less as a literal lie detector than as a piece of social theatre, with a great deal of human discretion built in. The priest heating the iron controlled its temperature and the length of the blessing. The men judging a healing wound 3 days later had considerable latitude in deciding what counted as festering versus clean, and the sheer terror of facing the ordeal may have pushed the truly guilty to confess or settle, beforehand rather than gamble on the iron. Some historians argue the whole system worked partly as a filter, that the innocent, believing God would protect them, were willing to undergo it, while the guilty, sharing that same belief, backed down, so that the outcome was often decided before anyone touched hot metal at all. Seen that way, the ordeal was not simply medieval people being credulous. It was a society without forensic science, building a machine out of faith, fear, and human judgment, and running the hardest cases through it because they genuinely could not think of anything better, and because they trusted, above all, that whatever the iron decided, God had decided it. Chapter 5. Enough true cross to build a ship. Somewhere in medieval Europe, if you had gathered up every fragment of wood that a church claimed came from the true cross, the actual cross on which Christ was crucified, and stacked them together, you would have had, by the sour estimate of critics even at the time, enough timber to build a ship or several. The theologian and reformer John Calvin would later make exactly this jab in the 16th century, calculating that the surviving pieces would fill a large ship and that a strong man could scarcely carry them. But the observation was obvious to anyone paying attention centuries earlier. There was vastly more true cross in circulation than one cross could ever have provided, and yet each fragment was venerated with total sincerity, kissed, wept over, and housed in gold, because the medieval world ran on relics, the physical remains of holy people and holy events, and believed in them not as symbols, but as working objects, power sources with the saint still, in some real sense, present inside. To understand why a splinter of wood could be worth more than a castle, you have to grasp the theology of the relic, which was not vague sentiment, but a specific and widely held doctrine. A saint, upon death, went to heaven, but did not entirely leave. The saint's power, their virtues, remained concentrated in their earthly remains, so that the bones, blood, hair, and even the possessions and clothing of a holy person became conduits through which that power could still act in the world. A relic was, in effect, a saint's continued presence on earth, and touching it, praying beside it, or being buried near it, put you in direct contact with a being who now sat beside God and could carry your petitions upward. This is why relics healed the sick, why the crippled and blind were carried to shrines from across the continent, and why possessing a great relic made a church not merely prestigious, but genuinely, functionally holy. A place where heaven and earth were understood to touch. Relics were graded roughly into a hierarchy that the church itself came to formalize, and the distinctions mattered enormously to their value. First-class relics were the physical remains of a saint's body, bones above all, but also blood, hair, teeth, and preserved flesh. Second-class relics were objects the saint had owned or regularly used in life, clothing, a book, an instrument of their martyrdom. Third-class relics were anything that had merely touched a first-class relic, which meant holiness could be transmitted by contact and conveniently mass-produced. A cloth pressed against a saint's bones became itself a relic to be distributed. This transmissibility is part of what made the relic economy so explosive, because it meant the supply of holy objects was, in principle, limitless. Press enough cloths against enough bones, and you could supply 1,000 churches from a single skeleton. The relics that commanded the very highest reverence were those connected directly to Christ and the Virgin Mary, and here the theology ran into an awkward problem that the medieval imagination solved with remarkable creativity. Christ and Mary, according to doctrine, had both been bodily assumed into heaven, which meant there could be no skeletons, no bones, no bodily remains to venerate. You cannot keep the finger of a person who took their whole body to heaven. So devotion focused on the things Christ had touched or shed. The wood of the cross, the crown of thorns, the nails, the holy lance that pierced his side, the shroud, and the few bodily substances that might plausibly have been left behind before the Ascension. Chief among these were relics of the Passion, and the true cross was the crown jewel of them all. The true cross had an origin story that gave the whole trade its founding legend, and it traced back to Helena, the mother of the Emperor Constantine, who in the early 4th century travelled to Jerusalem and, according to tradition, discovered the buried cross at the site of the crucifixion. From that single discovery, fragments were said to have been distributed across Christendom, multiplying as they went, until pieces of the true cross were enshrined in hundreds of churches from Constantinople to the far west. The medieval defence of why there was so much of it was itself a small miracle of theology. Some argued that the wood of the true cross, being divine, regenerated, that you could take fragment after fragment and it would never diminish. So the impossible arithmetic wasn't fraud but proof of the relic's holy nature. It is a genuinely elegant piece of reasoning, in that it takes the single most damning piece of evidence against the relics and converts it into evidence for them. But the true cross was only the most famous of a vast and frequently duplicated inventory, and the duplications are where the medieval relic trade tips from earnest devotion into something closer to comedy. The head of John the Baptist was a particularly popular relic, venerated in multiple locations at once. Amiens in France claimed the front of the skull, while other churches claimed the jaw, other fragments, or the whole head entire, so that a determined pilgrim could visit several complete heads of the same saint across Europe without anyone quite acknowledging the problem. Fingers, arms, and skulls of major saints existed in improbable multiples. There were enough alleged fragments of the manger, the crown of thorns, and the holy nail scattered across the continent to raise the same quiet arithmetic that dogged the cross, and the faithful, by and large, did not do the math, because each shrine's relic was, to the people who came to it, simply real. The catalogue of stranger relics is where the medieval appetite for the physical presence of the holy becomes almost startling. Several churches claim to possess vials of the Virgin Mary's breast milk, dried or preserved, venerated as a substance of extraordinary power despite the obvious difficulty of authenticating such a thing across 1,000 years. Calvin again scoffed that there was so much of it that a cow could not have produced the quantity displayed across Europe. Others claimed to hold Christ's baby teeth, his umbilical cord, or the holy prepuce, the foreskin from his circumcision, which was, in the theology of a Christ assumed bodily into heaven, the one piece of his flesh that could plausibly have been left behind on earth. At least a handful of churches across medieval Europe claimed to possess the one true holy prepuce simultaneously, a competition nobody quite knew how to referee. And the relic was venerated seriously enough that theologians genuinely debated whether it could exist at all if Christ's body had ascended whole. The economic engine driving all of this was pilgrimage, and it is impossible to overstate how much medieval life, movement and money organised itself around the journey to a shrine to be near a relic. Pilgrims travelled staggering distances, to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela in Spain to visit the supposed tomb of the Apostle James, to Canterbury to visit the shrine of Thomas Becket, murdered in his own cathedral in 1170 and generating miracles almost immediately. A great relic drew a flood of pilgrims, and pilgrims brought offerings, bought lodging, food, and badges, and left donations, so that a popular shrine became the economic heart of a town, and the financial engine of the church that housed it. The murdered Becket's shrine at Canterbury became one of the wealthiest in Europe, its jewels and gold accumulated from a century of pilgrim offerings, and the pilgrim traffic it generated is the literal framing device of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, a company of travellers riding to Becket's bones, telling stories to pass the miles. Where there is that much money and that much demand, there is inevitably supply that outruns honesty, and the medieval relic trade was riddled with fraud on a scale that even devout contemporaries recognised and condemned. Relics were stolen. There was a whole genre of medieval literature, the translatio, that recounted the theft of a saint's bones from one town by another, often narrated approvingly as the saint wanting to be moved. Relics were forged wholesale. Animal bones sold as saints' bones, ordinary wood sold as the true cross, cloth soaked in something red and sold as a martyr's blood. Guibert of Nogent, a French monk writing around 1120, produced a remarkable treatise attacking the abuses of the relic cult, ridiculing the multiplication of relics, and pointing out, among other things, the absurdity of two different monasteries, both claiming to hold the head of John the Baptist, which, as he dryly noted, would mean the saint had two heads. The critique came from inside the faith, from a believing monk disgusted not by relics themselves but by the fraud debasing them. The chaotic and often mercenary supply of relics reached its most spectacular peak with the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when a Crusader army, instead of reaching the Holy Land, sacked the Christian city of Constantinople, the greatest repository of relics in the world, accumulated over 9 centuries as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The looted city poured its sacred treasures westward, fragments of the true cross, the crown of thorns, portions of the Holy Lance, and countless saints' bones flooded into Western Europe in the years after, dramatically enriching the relic collections of France and Italy. King Louis IX of France, later canonised as Saint Louis, purchased the crown of thorns and other passion relics from the financially desperate Latin Emperor of Constantinople for an enormous sum, reportedly far more than the cost of building a church, and then built the breathtaking Sainte-Chapelle in Paris specifically to house them. A jewel box of a chapel, walls of stained glass, constructed as an oversized reliquary for a crown of thorns of deeply uncertain provenance, and standing gloriously to this day. For all the fraud and all the mathematics that plainly didn't add up, it would badly miss the point to file the relic cult under simple gullibility, because for medieval people, the relic answered a profound and genuine human need: to make the holy tangible, to close the terrifying distance between an ordinary suffering person and a god who otherwise dwelt impossibly far away. A pilgrim who had walked 500 miles to press their forehead against a saint's tomb was not a fool being conned. They were a person reaching with everything they had for contact with a power they believed could heal their child, forgive their sins, or carry their grief to heaven. The bones might be a sheep's, the cross fragment might be ordinary oak, the whole system might have been shot through with liars selling wood, and still the faith poured into it was real, the comfort it gave was real, and the cathedrals it built are some of the most beautiful things human beings have ever made. That a splinter of the wrong wood, wrapped in gold and believed in hard enough, could raise Sainte-Chapelle out of the ground is either the most damning verdict on the whole enterprise, or its strange and genuine vindication, and the medieval pilgrim, kneeling in that impossible light, would not have felt the difference mattered at all. Chapter 6. Comets, Planets, and the Sky as a Doom newspaper. When Halley's comet crossed the sky in the spring of 1066, blazing bright enough to alarm all of Europe, the people watching it did not see a ball of ice on an orbit. They saw a message, and within months the message seemed to come true when Harold of England died at Hastings and William of Normandy took his crown. The comet was stitched into the Bayeux Tapestry itself, a crowd of Englishmen pointing up in alarm at the streaking star while a shaken Harold sits on his new throne, with a caption noting simply that they marvel at the star, a piece of contemporary reporting that treats a comet as front-page political news, an omen of the fall of a king, embroidered into the historical record with the same seriousness as the battle it foretold. To the medieval mind, this was not superstition layered over the news. The comet was the news, a headline written in the sky by God, and reading it correctly was a matter of real and urgent importance. The sky, for medieval Europe, functioned as something between a newspaper and a warning system, a surface on which God and the heavens published announcements about the fate of kingdoms, the deaths of the powerful, plagues, wars, and famines, for anyone learned enough to interpret them, and comets sat at the very top of this ominous hierarchy, because unlike the fixed and orderly stars, a comet was an intruder. It appeared without warning, blazed strangely for weeks, dragged a tail across constellations that had been stable since creation, and then vanished, violating the perfect regularity that the heavens were supposed to embody. In a cosmos where the ordinary state of the sky was changelessness, anything that changed had to mean something, and the appearance of a comet was read almost universally as a portent of disaster, specifically and repeatedly as a sign foretelling the death of a king or a great catastrophe about to fall on the land. This belief was not confined to frightened peasants. It was held by the most educated men of the age, and the comet as omen tradition ran straight through the learned world with the full backing of ancient authority. It came down from classical writers. The Roman philosopher Seneca had catalogued comets, and Pliny had classified their shapes and the disasters each type foretold. A sword-shaped comet meaning war, a comet in a particular quarter of the sky meaning the death of a ruler. Medieval chroniclers dutifully recorded comets alongside the calamities they were assumed to announce, building a self-reinforcing archive. Because something bad happens somewhere in any given year, and kings die regularly, a comet could always be paired retroactively with a disaster, and the pairing then stood as fresh proof that comets foretold disaster. The logic was airtight in the way that only unfalsifiable logic can be. There was no comet that could appear and not be followed eventually by some misfortune to confirm it. Beneath the dramatic terror of comets lay a far more systematic and respectable discipline, which was astrology proper, the detailed study of the positions and movements of the planets and their supposed influence on earthly affairs. and it is genuinely difficult for a modern person to grasp how intellectually respectable astrology was in the medieval world. This was not the horoscope column of a newspaper. It was a serious subject of university study, taught alongside astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, considered a legitimate science with a rigorous mathematical basis. The distinction we draw so sharply between astronomy, the real science of celestial mechanics, and astrology, the pseudoscience of celestial influence, simply did not exist in the same form. The same scholars practiced both, using the same careful observations and calculations, because the underlying assumption that the heavens influenced the earth was taken as an obvious physical fact. The moon moved the tides and the sun drove the seasons, so why on earth would the other heavenly bodies not exert their own influences on the world below? That assumption gave astrology a foundation that felt not mystical but mechanical, and the medieval scholar reasoning about planetary influence believed he was doing physics. Each planet was thought to radiate a particular quality. Mars, red and associated with the god of war, brought heat, conflict and aggression. Saturn, slow and distant and cold, brought melancholy, age and calamity. Jupiter brought fortune and expansion. Venus, love and fertility. When these bodies moved into particular arrangements relative to one another, conjunctions when two planets aligned being the most powerful, their combined influences were believed to shape events on Earth in ways a skilled astrologer could calculate in advance. This is why the great medical faculties treated astrology as essential to medicine, why kings kept court astrologers, and why casting a horoscope for the precise moment of a birth, a coronation, or the start of a battle was considered prudent statecraft rather than idle fortune-telling. The single most consequential application of this planetary logic came with the greatest catastrophe of the age, because when the Black Death swept into Europe in 1347 and 1348, the most learned explanation offered for it was astrological. The medical faculty of the University of Paris, asked by King Philip VI to determine the cause of the plague, produced a formal report in 1348 that traced the disease to a conjunction of three planets, Saturn, Jupiter and Mars, in the sign of Aquarius on the 20th of March, 1345, 3 years earlier. This alignment, the professors explained, had corrupted the atmosphere, drawing up poisonous vapours from the earth and sea that spread the disease through the air as a pestilential miasma. This was the considered judgment of the most prestigious medical minds in Europe delivered to the King of France, blaming the deadliest pandemic in Western history on a planetary conjunction. And it was not a fringe view, but the mainstream learned consensus, taught and repeated as the authoritative explanation for why a third of the continent was dying. The genius and the tragedy of the astrological explanation was that it was, by the standards of its time, the rational and scientific response. The alternative explanations were considerably darker. While the university men blamed the planets and the corrupted air, popular fear reached for causes closer to hand, and across the Rhineland and beyond, communities blamed the Jews, accusing them of poisoning wells and massacring entire Jewish populations in a wave of atrocities that swept the continent alongside the plague itself. Set against that, the Paris faculty's planetary conjunction was the sober, educated, humane diagnosis. It blamed the indifferent heavens rather than a hated minority, and it did not lead anyone to light a fire. It is a genuinely uncomfortable thing to sit with, that in the face of mass death, the planets did it, was the responsible scientific position, the one held by the people trying hardest to think clearly, and the one that killed no one. Astrology's reach extended to the very top of the institution we might expect to have condemned it, because a number of medieval and Renaissance popes employed astrologers and took their counsel seriously, despite an official church teaching that sat uneasily with the whole enterprise. The theological problem was genuine and much debated. If the stars determined events, what became of human free will and of God's providence? The Church's careful resolution, worked out by theologians including Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, was that the heavens could incline but not compel. The stars might influence the body and its passions, and so affect the general run of earthly events. But the rational human soul remained free to resist, so that the wise man rules the stars, rather than being ruled by them. This elegant compromise licensed a vast amount of astrological practice while formally preserving free will, and it allowed popes, kings and bishops to consult astrologers with a clear conscience. treating planetary influence as a real force to be reckoned with, like weather, rather than an iron fate. The practical machinery of medieval astrology was genuinely sophisticated, resting on centuries of accumulated observation and real mathematical skill, most of it inherited through the Islamic world. The foundational text was Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, the great 2nd century astrological treatise that travelled with his astronomical work, the Almagest, and much of the detailed technique reached Europe via translations from Arabic, along with the work of Islamic astronomers who had refined and extended the Greek material for centuries. Astrologers used instruments of real precision, the astrolabe above all, a beautiful brass device that modelled the sky and let its user calculate the positions of stars and planets, tell the time, and cast horoscopes. And the tables of planetary positions they worked from, such as the Alphonsine tables compiled in 13th century Castile, represented a monumental effort of observation and computation. The astrologer casting your fortune was doing real, hard mathematics. He was simply pointing at mathematics at a question the stars could not answer. For all that comets and conjunctions foretold doom, the sky was also a vast and reliable clock, calendar, and compass that governed the rhythm of medieval life in ways that had nothing to do with omens and everything to do with survival. The movement of the sun set the working day. The phases of the moon governed the calendar of fasts and feasts, with the date of Easter itself calculated from the moon in a complex reckoning called the computus that occupied some of the best mathematical minds of the age. The stars guided travellers and increasingly sailors. The same heavens that terrified people with comets fed them by marking the seasons for planting and harvest, and the medieval farmer's almanac was a practical document of when to sow and reap as much as a repository of astrological lore. This is the crucial thing to hold about the medieval sky. It was not merely a source of dread, but a genuine and indispensable information system, the most important one people had, telling them the time, the date, the season, the direction, and, they were certain, the future. And so the medieval relationship with the heavens turns out to be less alien than it first appears, because underneath the omens and the conjunctions lay a completely reasonable intuition that the sky affects the earth, pushed one logical step too far. They were right that the heavens governed time, the seasons, the tides, and the growth of crops. They were right that careful observation of the sky yielded real, usable knowledge. They simply extended that true and observable influence into a realm where it did not reach, concluding that because the sun ripens the wheat, Saturn must curdle the fate of kings. The astronomer and the astrologer were the same person, doing the same rigorous mathematics, looking through the same instruments at the same stars. And the tragedy is only that half of what they saw was real, and half was a story they had been told the sky was telling, with no way yet to know which half was which. When they looked up at Halley's Comet and saw the death of a king, they were doing their honest best to read a message they were certain had been written for them, in the one place they had always been taught to look for the future. Chapter 7. Tuesday. Magic. Charms, amulets, and words with power. The average medieval person was not a witch, did not attend a Black Sabbath, and never once flew on a broomstick. But they almost certainly carried a charm against toothache, muttered a rhyming formula over a burn, and wore a written prayer sewn into their clothing to keep them safe on the road. This is the magic that actually filled medieval life. Not the dramatic, diabolical sorcery of later witch hunt paranoia, but a dense, everyday web of small practical enchantments woven so tightly into ordinary Christianity that most people would not have been able to tell you where religion ended and magic began, because to them there was no clear line, and the same person who took communion on Sunday would that same week tie a spider in a nutshell around their neck to cure a fever, seeing no contradiction whatsoever. The engine that drove nearly all of this everyday magic was a single conviction that ran deep through the medieval world, that words, spoken or written in the right form, had real physical power to act on the world. A word was not merely a label for a thing, it could do something to that thing. This is not as strange as it sounds if you remember the theological air these people breathed. God had created the entire universe by speaking, saying, "Let there be light," and Christ had healed the sick and calmed storms with a word, so the idea that language could reach out and change physical reality was built into the deepest foundations of the faith. If the word made the world, then words, used correctly, could reshape small corners of it, and the charm was simply the practical application of that principle to a bad tooth or a bleeding wound. The most common of all these verbal magics was the healing charm, and thousands survive in medieval manuscripts, often jotted in the margins of medical texts or prayer books by their owners, which tells you they were meant to be used, not merely read. A charm was typically a short formula, sometimes a prayer, sometimes a narrative, sometimes a string of mysterious words, recited over the sufferer, often a set number of times and accompanied by a specific gesture like making the sign of the cross. To stop bleeding, one enormously widespread charm invoked the story of Christ being baptized in the River Jordan, which the charm claimed stood still at that moment, and by the power of that memory commanded the patient's blood to likewise stand still, the logic being that reciting a holy event forced the world to imitate it. These are called narrative charms, and they worked on the principle that telling the right sacred story with enough conviction bent present reality into the same shape. Some charms leaned less on Christian narrative and more on sheer mysterious potency of language, and the most famous of all is one you still know, because it survived into the modern world as a magician's joke, abracadabra. This word was a genuine medieval and ancient healing charm, prescribed as far back as the Roman physician Cerinus Sammonicus in the 3rd century, as a cure for fever and ague, and it was written not merely spoken, inscribed on a piece of parchment in a specific shrinking triangle, abracadabra on the first line, abracadabra on the next, abracadabra below that, each line dropping a letter until it tapered to a single A. The diminishing word was worn around the neck, and as the letters vanished line by line, the fever was meant to vanish with them, the shrinking text pulling the illness down to nothing, a word processor for disease, dwindling the sickness away one letter at a time. This brings us to the amulet, the physical object worn or carried for protection, which was the material cousin of the spoken charm and every bit as ubiquitous. Amulets could be almost anything invested with power. A written charm folded and sewn into a pouch, a stone believed to hold particular virtues, a piece of coral hung on a baby to ward off the evil eye, a badge stamped with a holy image. Certain objects were prized for inherent properties that medieval natural philosophy took entirely seriously. Coral was thought to protect children and staunch bleeding. A toadstone, actually a fossilized fish tooth, but believed to come from the head of a toad, was set in rings to detect poison and cure kidney disease. And jet, the black stone, was burned to drive away evil spirits and test for various afflictions. The line between an amulet, a medicine, and a relic was, again, gloriously blurry. All three were physical objects that channeled invisible power into the body of the person who carried them. The written amulet deserves special attention because it shows most clearly how the power of holy words was thought to work through the very ink and parchment. People wore verses of scripture, especially the opening of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, folded up and carried on the body as protection, the physical text itself acting as a shield. Charms were written on scraps of parchment and worn against the skin, and there was a widespread practice of writing a charm on a food item, an apple, a wafer, a piece of bread, sometimes butter, and then eating it, so the powerful words could be physically ingested and go to work inside the body. Women in difficult childbirth were girded with long birth girdles, parchment scrolls covered in prayers, charms and holy names wrapped around the belly to ease delivery, and modern chemical analysis of one surviving example has found traces of honey, milk, and other substances consistent with its actually having been used by labouring mothers, pressed against the body exactly as intended. Between the ordinary villager with a charm and the frightening figure of the diabolical witch stood a whole class of people who made a living from magic, and were, for most of the Middle Ages, a normal and accepted part of village life, the cunning folk. These were local practitioners, men and women, who provided the community's magical services, healing the sick with charms and herbs, finding lost or stolen property, identifying thieves, telling fortunes, and crucially, protecting people against harmful magic. This last function is important, because the cunning folk were understood not as evil sorcerers, but as the defence against them, the person you went to when you believed a malevolent witch had cursed your cattle or your child, the counter-magician who could detect and undo hostile spells. They occupied a role somewhere between a doctor, a private investigator, a pharmacist, and a priest, and every community had one. Consulted openly, and without much shame for centuries before the witch hunts began to blur the distinction between helpful magic and harmful magic into a single crime. The techniques of the cunning folk and the ordinary charm user drew heavily on a principle that ran through all pre-modern magic, which scholars call sympathetic magic. The idea that things which resemble each other, or that were once in contact, retain a hidden connection that can be exploited. If two things looked alike, one could influence the other. If two things had touched, they stayed magically linked. This is the logic behind the doctrine of signatures, the widespread belief that God had marked healing plants with visible signs of what they cured. Walnuts, which resemble the brain, were thought good for the head. Lungwort, whose spotted leaves resemble diseased lung tissue, for the lungs. The yellow sap of celandine for jaundice, which yellows the skin. The plant told you what it healed by looking like the afflicted part, a helpful labelling system God had supposedly built into creation, and while it produced some genuinely useful remedies by accident, it produced far more that worked only because the leaf happened to be the right shape. The gemstones and their properties formed an entire branch of this knowledge, catalogued in books called lapidaries that sat on the same shelf as the bestiaries and were treated with the same authority. A lapidary listed stones and their powers with total confidence. The diamond made its wearer bold and could not be broken except by soaking in fresh goat's blood. The emerald protected chastity, and held under the tongue, granted prophecy. The sapphire cooled fevers and freed prisoners. The amethyst, whose name comes from the Greek for not drunk, prevented intoxication, which is why wine cups and rings were sometimes set with it, in the earnest hope of drinking all night without consequence. These were not idle beliefs. They governed real behaviour, as people bought particular stones for particular protections, and a physician might prescribe a gem as readily as a herb, grinding it into a powder, or having the patient wear it against the skin where its virtue could radiate into the body. The single, most important thing to understand about all of this magic is that the Church's relationship with it was deeply and revealingly inconsistent, because so much of what people did shaded imperceptibly from sanctioned religion into forbidden magic, and the boundary moved depending on who was doing the drawing. The Church offered its own vast arsenal of protective power that was, functionally, magic with an official license. Holy water sprinkled to drive off demons and blight. Blessed candles and palms kept in the home against storms and lightning. Church bells rung during tempests, specifically to scatter the demons believed to ride the thunder. The sign of the cross made against every danger, and the Mass itself, in which a priest's Latin words were believed to transform bread and wine into the literal body and blood of Christ. To the ordinary person, the priest muttering Latin over the altar to work a miracle, and the cunning woman muttering a charm over a wound were doing recognisably the same kind of thing, and the Church's insistence that one was holy sacrament and the other was dangerous superstition was a distinction of authority and source, not of underlying mechanism. This blurriness is exactly why the practice of using the consecrated communion wafer for magic was such a persistent problem that the Church had to legislate against it repeatedly. If the wafer truly became the body of Christ, the single most powerful holy object imaginable, God himself made physically present and placed on your tongue, then it was, to the folk mind, the ultimate ingredient for any charm, and people did indeed try to smuggle the host out of Mass unswallowed to use it for their own purposes, crumbled over a garden to ensure a good harvest, fed to animals or bees to keep them healthy and productive, carried as the supreme protective amulet, or deployed in healing. The Church was so alarmed by this that it changed its own practices in response, and part of the reason the medieval laity increasingly received communion, only rarely, and had the wafer placed directly on the tongue rather than in the hand, was precisely to stop people from pocketing God to use in the garden. For all the effort the Church put into policing the boundary, the deep truth of medieval magic is that it was not a rival to Christianity, but a native outgrowth of it. The same believing world that produced saints and relics and holy words inevitably produced charms and amulets and cunning folk, because they all rested on one shared foundation, the conviction that the invisible world of spirit was constantly, powerfully at work in the visible world of matter, and that the right words, objects and gestures could reach across and move it. The person tying a charm around a sick child's neck was not rejecting their faith or dabbling in the dark. They were applying the exact same logic that filled the cathedrals, extended to the small emergencies of daily life that no priest could be summoned for at midnight. And in a world without antibiotics, without anaesthetic, without any reliable defence against the fever burning through a child at 2 a.m, the charm was not a foolish superstition, but the only thing a terrified parent had, a set of powerful words to say into the dark, a scrap of holy parchment pressed to a hot forehead, and the desperate, entirely human hope that saying the right thing in the right way might be enough to hold back the night. Chapter 8. Monsters at the edge of the map. If you had asked an educated medieval European what lived at the far edges of the world, beyond the last known kingdom, past the deserts and the seas nobody had crossed, they would not have shrugged and admitted ignorance. They would have told you, with real specificity, that out there lived men with the heads of dogs, men with a single enormous foot, men whose faces sat in the middle of their chests, and they would have named their sources, cited their authorities, and drawn these creatures onto the actual maps. The medieval world map was not blank at its edges. It was populated, carefully, confidently, and completely wrongly, with a whole catalogue of monstrous races that scholars did not regard as fantasy, but as sober geographical fact, inherited from the ancients and placed at the margins of the known, because that was clearly where such things must be. The foundational belief underlying all of this was a specific and rather elegant piece of medieval reasoning, that the world grew stranger the further you travelled from its civilised centre. Nearby lands held ordinary people, distant lands held marvels, and at the very edge of the earth, in the extreme heat of the far south or the far east, nature produced its most extreme and deformed creations. This wasn't random. It followed from the theory of climate zones inherited from the Greeks, which held that the intense heat of the equatorial and tropical regions warped and exaggerated the living things born there, producing bodies that departed from the normal human form. So when a scholar placed dog-headed men in India or Africa, he was not being whimsical. He was applying a coherent theory that said extreme environments produce extreme bodies, and reasoning that the farther a land lay from temperate Europe, the more monstrous its inhabitants should be. The master catalogue of these creatures came, as so much else did, from Pliny the Elder, whose first-century natural history devoted long passages to the monstrous races of distant lands, and whose authority was so immense that these beings are often called the Plinian races to this day. Pliny had compiled them from earlier Greek writers, especially Ctesias, a Greek physician who had served at the Persian court and written wonders about India, and Megasthenes, a Greek ambassador to India whose reports mixed real observation with fantastic hearsay. These accounts, filtered through Pliny and then through the widely copied 3rd century compiler Solinus, became the standard medieval knowledge of the world's edges, repeated in encyclopedias for over 1,000 years, cited by scholars who had no more reason to doubt Pliny on the dog-headed men than to doubt him on elephants, which he described in the same book with equal confidence and considerably more accuracy. The most famous of all the monstrous races were the cynocephali, the dog-headed men, a race of humans with fully canine heads who lived, depending on the source, in India or in the deserts of Africa, communicated by barking and dressed in animal skins. They were among the most persistent and widely believed of all the races, precisely because they sat right on the theologically fascinating line between man and beast, and medieval thinkers genuinely debated whether such a creature possessed a rational soul and could therefore be baptized and saved. This was not an idle question. St. Christopher, in one strand of Eastern tradition, was depicted as a dog-headed man, a cynocephalus converted to Christianity, and there survive Byzantine icons showing the saint who carried Christ across the river with the head of a dog. The dog-headed men were real enough to medieval Christians that the salvation of their souls was a matter for serious theological reflection. The Blemmies were stranger still, and they are the race that most delights anyone who encounters them, because they had no heads at all. Their faces were set directly into their chests, eyes at shoulder height, mouth in the middle of the torso. Pliny placed them in Africa, in Libya, or near the source of the Nile, and medieval maps and manuscripts illustrated them faithfully. A broad-shouldered figure with a face where a chest should be, gazing out from the margins of the world. Their headlessness posed no problem to the medieval reader, who accepted that distant nature produced extreme forms, and the Blemmies turn up everywhere from serious geographical texts to the travel narrative of Sir John Mandeville, and eventually into Shakespeare, whose Othello wins Desdemona's heart partly by telling her of the men whose heads grow beneath their shoulders, a direct echo of the Blemmies, still circulating as a marvel of distant lands in the early 17th century. Then there were the Shearpods, or Monopods, perhaps the most endearing of the entire catalogue, a race of men who each possessed a single enormous leg and foot, on which they hopped about with surprising speed. and whose defining behaviour was that, in the fierce heat of their homeland, they would lie on their backs and raise that one giant foot into the air to shade themselves from the sun, using their own foot as a parasol. The name comes from the Greek for shadow foot, and the image of a man napping in the shade of his own oversized soul was reproduced across medieval manuscripts and carved into churches with complete seriousness, as a genuine race inhabiting the edge of the world. There is something almost tender about the specificity of the detail, not merely that they had one foot, but that they had worked out a practical use for it, and it captures exactly the texture of these beliefs, which were not vague rumours of monsters, but fully imagined peoples with habits, customs, and daily routines. The catalogue ran on, each race a specialised departure from the human norm. The Panotti had ears so enormous they hung down to the ground, and could be wrapped around the body as blankets, or in some accounts used to fly. The Astomi, or apple smellers, had no mouths at all, and survived purely by inhaling the scent of fruit and flowers, dying if exposed to a foul smell. Pliny's mouthless men, kept alive on aroma alone. The Panotti's giant ears and the Astomi's missing mouths followed the same underlying logic. Take the human form and exaggerate or subtract one feature, and you have a new race for the map's edge. There were pygmies who waged eternal war against cranes, giants, races with backward-facing feet, races with a single central eye, and the Amictirae, whose lower lip was so large they could pull it up over their heads for shelter from the sun. A whole taxonomy of humanity-adjacent beings, each catalogued as carefully as a naturalist catalogues finches. What makes all this more than a bestiary of imaginary people is that these creatures were placed on real maps, in real geographical relationships, on documents meant to represent the actual world. The great medieval Mappae Mundi, world maps like the enormous Hereford map, made around 1300 and still surviving in Hereford Cathedral in England, depicted the known world with Jerusalem at the centre and the monstrous races arranged carefully around the edges, particularly along the southern rim of Africa. The Hereford map shows the Blemmies, the Cyopods, the dog-headed men, and a dozen others in their appointed places, each with a small caption, integrated seamlessly into a document that also shows real cities, real rivers, and real biblical sites. This was the medieval equivalent of an atlas, a serious attempt to portray the whole earth, and it placed the mouthless apple smellers alongside Rome and the Nile without any sense that it was mixing categories, because to its makers it wasn't. These maps carried a phrase that has passed into legend, though its actual medieval use was rarer than the modern imagination assumes. The warning Hic sunt dracones, here be dragons, supposedly inscribed at the unknown edges of maps to mark dangerous, unexplored territory. The famous phrase itself appears on only one known surviving early map, the Hunt Lennox globe of around 1510, right at the transition out of the true Middle Ages, so the popular image of medieval cartographers routinely scrawling "Here be dragons" across their blank spaces is largely a later romantic invention, but the underlying reality it points to is entirely true. Medieval maps did fill their edges and unknown regions with monsters, serpents, and marvels, and the dragon was among the creatures believed to inhabit the wild margins of the world. The phrase is a myth. The monsters on the maps are not. The medieval traveller's imagination was fed and inflamed above all by one book, the enormously popular Travels of Sir John Mandeville, which appeared in the mid-14th century and claimed to be the eyewitness account of an English knight's journey through the Holy Land, India, and the fabulous realms beyond, all the way to the court of the Great Khan. Mandeville's Travels was a medieval bestseller, translated into every major European language and surviving in hundreds of manuscripts, and it retailed the entire catalogue of monstrous races as things the author claimed to have personally encountered. The Blemmies, the Cynocephali, the one-eyed and the giant-eared, along with the wealth of the Indies and the wonders of the East. The book is almost certainly a compilation assembled from earlier sources by an author who never made the journey, but medieval readers took it as genuine travel writing, and it shaped European ideas of the distant world for 2 centuries. Columbus himself owned and annotated a copy, sailing west with his head partly full of Mandeville's marvels. That connection to Columbus is where the whole edifice of medieval geographical belief collides with the age of exploration, and produces one of history's most consequential encounters between fantasy and fact. The explorers who set out in the 15th and 16th centuries carried these expectations with them. They had read Pliny, Mandeville, and the encyclopedias, and they genuinely expected to find the monstrous races, the dog-headed men, the giants, the people with tails, somewhere beyond the horizon. Columbus's journals record his men reporting rumours of cannibals with dog faces and of an island of people born with tails, and later Spanish accounts of the New World are shot through with the search for Amazons, giants, and the other creatures the old texts had promised. The word cannibal itself derives from Carib, the people Columbus encountered, tangled up with his expectation of finding the dog-headed, man-eating races Marco Polo and Pliny had described. The medieval monster catalogue actively shaping how Europeans perceived and named the actual peoples they met. And here the story turns genuinely dark, because the medieval theory that distant lands held less than fully human beings did not stay an innocent marvel once Europeans actually reached those lands and met real people living in them. The intellectual habit of expecting monsters at the world's edge, of assuming that the inhabitants of distant places were deformed, bestial, or subhuman, provided a ready-made framework for dehumanizing the peoples that explorers and colonizers encountered, and the debates about whether the monstrous races had souls slid with terrible ease into debates about whether the indigenous peoples of the Americas were fully human and could be justly enslaved. The whimsical man napping under his own giant foot and the dog-headed saint were the harmless face of a way of thinking that also carried, folded inside it, the assumption that humanity thinned out as you travelled from Europe, an assumption that would do enormous damage the moment ships full of Europeans arrived on shores full of people the old books had taught them to expect as monsters. For all that dark tale, the monstrous races began as something more innocent and more human than sinister, an honest attempt to fill in the vast unknown of a world that medieval Europeans could not travel across and could not verify, using the only authorities they had, which were ancient, respected, and wrong. They knew the world was large and mostly unseen. They knew that strange true things existed at its edges, because real travellers came back with real accounts of elephants, giraffes, and rhinoceroses that sounded every bit as improbable as any blemmy, and lacking any way to sort the true marvel from the false one, they believed both, cataloguing the one-footed shade-nappers alongside the genuinely existing hippopotamus with the same careful hand. The tragedy and the charm of the medieval map is that its makers were not lying and were not stupid. They were doing their level best to draw a world they had never seen, trusting the wise men of the past to tell them what lay in the dark beyond the last road, and the wise men of the past had told them with total confidence that out there a man could lie down in the noonday heat and lift one enormous foot against the sun. Chapter 9. Killing Kings and Curing Warts. Everyday Superstition. For roughly 700 years, the kings of England and France cured a disfiguring disease by touching people, thousands of them, in vast public ceremonies, and everyone involved, king and sufferer alike, believed it genuinely worked. The disease was scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that swells the lymph nodes of the neck into disfiguring lumps and open sores, and it was known across medieval Europe simply as the king's evil, because the accepted cure was the touch of a royal hand. This was not a fringe belief or a peasant rumour. It was formal state ritual, performed by anointed monarchs, recorded by their governments, and sought by enormous crowds of the afflicted who travelled long distances for their moment beneath the royal fingers. Everyday superstition operating at the very summit of medieval power. The belief rested on the doctrine that the king was no ordinary man but a sacred figure, anointed with holy oil at his coronation in a rite that made his body a vessel of divine power, capable of channeling God's healing directly into the sick. The practice seems to have taken firm hold in England under Edward the Confessor in the 11th century, and in France under the Capetian kings around the same era, and it grew into a highly organised ceremony. The king would touch or stroke the sores on the sufferer's neck, make the sign of the cross, and often present the person with a coin. In England, a gold coin called an angel, pierced so it could be worn around the neck as a protective amulet against the disease's return. The numbers were staggering. Later monarchs touched thousands per year, and Charles II of England, well after the Middle Ages, is recorded as having touched nearly 100,000 people over his reign, a scale that tells you how deeply the belief endured. The reason the royal touch survived so long is the same reason bloodletting did. Scrofula, tuberculous or not, often goes into natural remission on its own, its swellings receding for reasons that had nothing to do with the king, so that a meaningful fraction of those touched genuinely got better afterward and credited the crown. Every spontaneous recovery was a fresh testimonial, Every relapse was blamed on insufficient faith or the disease's severity, and the belief renewed itself endlessly on a foundation of coincidence read as miracle. The English monarchy performed the ceremony until Queen Anne, who touched the infant Samuel Johnson, the future dictionary maker, in 1712 in one of the last such rituals, and the French kings continued even longer, the practice surviving in France until the coronation of Charles X in 1825, when a king of France touched the sick, barely 2 centuries ago, in a rite descended directly from the medieval belief in the healing hand. If the king's touch was superstition at the top of society, the same machinery of magical thinking ran through every level of daily life below, governing the smallest decisions with an elaborate code of luck, omen, and prohibition. Days of the week and days of the calendar carried fixed fortunes, and chief among the unlucky were the Egyptian days, or dies Egyptiaci, a fixed set of dates scattered through the year, usually reckoned as 2 per month, on which it was dangerous to begin any important undertaking, to travel, to marry, or to let blood. These unlucky days were listed in calendars and almanacs with total seriousness, marked so that a person could check before starting a journey or a business the way a modern person checks the weather, and the belief was widespread enough that medical texts warned specifically against bloodletting on them. The fear of particular days folded into a much broader web of omens read from the ordinary events of daily life, each twitch of the natural world carrying a message for anyone attentive enough to catch it. A bird flying into the house foretold a death. An owl calling near a home was an omen of dying. Salt spilled invited misfortune to be countered by throwing a pinch over the left shoulder into the face of the devil who was believed to lurk on the sinister left side. The left side itself was suspect across the whole of medieval culture. The Latin for left, sinister, carried its ominous meaning straight into English, while the right, dexter, gave us dexterous and adroit, so that the very language encoded a moral geography in which the right hand was blessed and skilled, and the left was the devil's territory, unlucky and clumsy and to be watched. Numbers carried their own heavy freight of luck and dread, and the most enduring of all medieval number superstitions is one that still empties the 13th floor of hotels today. The fear of the number 13 tied firmly to the Last Supper, where 13 sat at the table and the 13th Judas betrayed Christ to his death. From this came the specific and durable belief that 13 people dining together was catastrophically unlucky, and that one of the diners, traditionally the first to rise or the last to sit, would die within the year. The number 3, by contrast, was wholly unlucky through its association with the Trinity, which is part of why so many charms, prayers and folk remedies had to be repeated exactly 3 times to take effect, the sacred number lending its power to the act of repetition. The remedies people actually used for their ailments blended real herbal knowledge with pure sympathetic magic, in proportions that shifted from the sensible to the frankly startling, and warts, being harmless, visible, and prone to disappearing on their own, attracted an especially rich crop of cures. The standard approach was transference, the magical shifting of the affliction from the body onto some other object, which then carried it away. To cure a wart, you might rub it with a piece of raw meat and then bury the meat, the wart supposedly rotting away as the meat rotted underground, or rub it with a stolen bit of bacon, or touch each wart with a pebble, seal the pebbles in a bag, and leave the bag at a crossroads, so that whoever picked up the bag would take the warts along with it. The logic of transference ran through folk medicine everywhere. The disease was a thing that could be moved off you and onto meat, stones, trees, or an unlucky stranger. Transference reached its most elaborate in the widespread cures that passed an illness into a living tree or animal, binding the patient's fate to another organism. A child with whooping cough or a rupture might be passed bodily through a split in a growing ash tree. The tree bound up afterward, and as the split healed and grew together, the child was believed to heal with it, their recovery magically linked to the closing wood. Fevers were transferred to trees by tying a lock of the patient's hair to a branch. Toothache was cured by driving a nail into an oak, pinning the pain into the tree. These were not the practices of a lunatic fringe, but ordinary respectable folk medicine, the standard first response to illness in villages that had no physician and could not have afforded one if they had, passed from grandmother to mother to daughter, as simply what you do when a child falls sick. Some of the era's most memorably strange beliefs clustered around the plants, and creatures thought to possess uncanny powers, and none was more famous than the mandrake, the root that supposedly screamed. The mandrake's forked root often grows into a shape suggestive of a human body, and from this resemblance grew an entire mythology. The plant was said to spring up beneath gallows, fed by the fluids of hanged men, and to let out a shriek when pulled from the ground so lethal that any human who heard it would die on the spot. The prescribed method of harvesting was accordingly elaborate. You were to loosen the earth around the root, tie it to a dog, and then retreat to a safe distance and call the dog, which would pull the mandrake free and die from the scream in the gardener's place. The root, once safely obtained, was among the most valued in the medieval pharmacy, used as a powerful sedative and anaesthetic, and as a supposed aid to fertility, its genuine narcotic properties, mandrake really does contain sedating alkaloids, lending real weight to its terrifying reputation. The animals of everyday life carried their own dense layer of belief, prized for parts and behaviours that folk tradition invested with power, the way the bestiaries had invested the lion and the pelican. The heart, teeth or claws of particular animals were carried as amulets. A hare crossing your path was a bad omen, hares being tangled up with witchcraft in the popular mind, since witches were widely believed able to transform themselves into hares to move about unseen. Bees were treated almost as members of the household, and there survived deep into modern times the custom of telling the bees, informing the hive of a death in the family, and sometimes draping it in black, in the belief that bees not properly told of their keeper's death would themselves die or abandon the hive. The horseshoe hung over the door for luck, and against witches, iron itself being widely believed to repel evil spirits and fairies, is another of these everyday protections that outlived the entire medieval world, and still hangs over doorways today, mostly by people who could not tell you it began as a charm against the fairy folk. For all its strangeness, this dense fabric of everyday superstition was not a separate, sillier world running alongside real medieval life. It was medieval life, the operating system on which ordinary people ran their days, made their decisions, treated their sick, and tried to steer a little luck their way in a world where so much was beyond any control. A person who had no antibiotics, no reliable harvest, no insurance against the death of a child or a cow, or a season's crop, reached naturally for whatever handhold on fate they could find. A lucky day chosen for the journey, a wart charmed onto a stranger's stone, a coin from the king's own hand worn against the neck. And the truly humbling thing, as you lie there listening, is how little of it has actually left us. We still knock on wood, still avoid the number 13, still throw salt over the left shoulder and hang horseshoes and cross our fingers, performing the fossilised remains of medieval magic in the middle of lives full of machines the medieval mind could not have dreamed. Proof that the believing age never entirely ended, and that the distance between us and the peasant charming a wart onto a buried scrap of meat is a great deal shorter than we like to think. Chapter 10. Nested spheres, the round earth, and a good night. Let's end the whole series by killing the single most famous thing everyone knows about the Middle Ages, because it is completely provably false. Medieval people did not think the earth was flat. This is perhaps the most durable myth about the medieval mind, taught for generations as settled fact, and it is wrong from top to bottom. Educated Europeans throughout the entire Middle Ages knew perfectly well that the earth was a sphere, had known it since antiquity, taught it in their universities, wrote it in their textbooks, and never seriously doubted it. The flat earth medieval peasant cowering at the edge of a disc is not a piece of history. It is a piece of 19th century propaganda, and the story of how that falsehood was invented is itself one of the strangest beliefs of all. Only this time, the strange belief is ours, about them. The sphericity of the earth was established knowledge in the ancient Greek world, demonstrated by observation and never lost. The Greeks had noticed that ships disappear hull first over the horizon, as if sinking behind a curve, that the earth casts a round shadow on the moon during a lunar eclipse, and that the visible stars change as you travel north or south, all of which point unavoidably to a spherical earth. Aristotle laid out these arguments in the 4th century BC, and around 240 BC, the Greek scholar Eratosthenes did something genuinely astonishing. He measured the circumference of the earth, comparing the angle of the sun's shadow at 2 Egyptian cities a known distance apart, and arrived at a figure remarkably close to the true value using nothing but geometry, shadows, and a walkable distance. This knowledge passed intact into the medieval world, and the men who inherited it never threw it away. The medieval textbooks are unambiguous on this point, which is why the flat Earth myth is so indefensible once you actually read them. The standard astronomy textbook of the medieval universities, used for centuries, was a work literally titled De Sphera Mundi, on the sphere of the world, written by John of Sacrobosco around 1230, which opened by explaining that the Earth is a sphere and rehearsing the classical proofs. Every university student who studied astronomy learned the round Earth from this book. It was as basic and uncontroversial as arithmetic. The great theologians affirmed it too. Thomas Aquinas used the sphericity of the Earth as a casual example of established knowledge, and Dante, writing the Divine Comedy around 1320, built his entire cosmos on a spherical Earth, sending his pilgrim down through the globe and out the other side to climb the mountain of Purgatory in the southern hemisphere, a geography that only works if the Earth is a ball. So where did the myth come from, if the medievals themselves were perfectly clear? It was largely manufactured in the 19th century by writers with an agenda, chief among them the American Washington Irving, who in his popular and heavily fictionalized 1828 biography of Columbus invented dramatic scenes of Columbus battling ignorant churchmen who insisted the Earth was flat and that he would sail off its edge. This never happened. The actual scholarly objection to Columbus was that he had badly underestimated the Earth's size. The learned men were right that the globe was far too large for his ships to reach Asia by sailing west, and Columbus only survived because an unknown continent happened to sit in the way. The flat Earth version was then seized upon later in the century by partisans in the fight between science and religion, who found it a useful stick with which to beat the medieval church, and it hardened into the fact everyone now learns as children, a myth about medieval stupidity that is itself a monument to how confidently a false belief can spread. Having cleared away what they did not believe, we can look at what they actually did believe about the cosmos, and it was a magnificent, intricate, and completely wrong structure of nested crystalline spheres. The medieval universe was geocentric. The Earth sat motionless at the centre, and around it turned a series of vast transparent spheres, each carrying a heavenly body. The sphere of the Moon closest, then Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and beyond them the sphere of the fixed stars, all of them nested one inside the next like the layers of an onion turning in stately eternal motion. This model came down from Aristotle, and was given its detailed mathematical form by Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD, whose great work, the Almagest, was the authoritative astronomy for over 1400 years. And it was not a crude guess, but a sophisticated system that genuinely predicted the movements of the planets with impressive accuracy. The great intellectual problem of this cosmos was that the planets refused to move in the simple circles the theory demanded. They sometimes appeared to slow, stop, and briefly reverse direction against the stars, a phenomenon called retrograde motion. And the solution medieval and ancient astronomers devised was one of the most ingenious wrong ideas in history, the epicycle. Rather than moving on its main sphere alone, each planet was said to move on a small circle, an epicycle, whose centre was itself carried around the larger circle, so that the planet traced a looping path that could account for the backward motion. When even this didn't quite fit the observations, astronomers add epicycles upon epicycles, small circles riding on small circles, tuning the model with ever more elaborate machinery until it matched the sky with remarkable precision. The result was a system of dizzying complexity that worked. It predicted eclipses and planetary positions well enough to serve for centuries, and was, in its fundamental picture of a central Earth, entirely false. The spheres were not merely geometry. They were alive with meaning and, in the medieval imagination, with sound and motion driven by love. The spheres were often thought to be moved by intelligences, angels assigned to turn them, and their perfect, eternal revolutions were believed to produce a music inaudible to human ears, the music of the spheres, a celestial harmony arising from the mathematical ratios of their motions, an idea reaching back to Pythagoras and taken up seriously by medieval thinkers. Dante ended his Paradiso with the famous line about the love that moves the sun and the other stars, capturing the medieval conviction that the whole vast clockwork of the heavens turned not by blind mechanics, but by love, the yearning of each sphere toward God, who dwelt beyond the outermost heaven, drawing the entire universe around in its great daily turn. It was a cosmos that was not only orderly but meaningful, every sphere a rung on a ladder ascending from the corrupt, changeable earth at the bottom to the perfect, unchanging divine at the top. That vertical structure carried the deepest assumption of the medieval cosmos, which was that the universe was arranged as a moral hierarchy, with the Earth's central position marking it not as important but as the lowest and basest point. This is the reverse of what modern people assume when they hear the Earth was at the centre. We imagine medieval humans placing themselves proudly at the hub of creation, but the medieval view was almost the opposite. The centre was the bottom, the sump of the universe, the place where heavy corruptible matter fell and collected, farthest from the perfect heavens and closest to hell, which sat at the very centre of the earth, the dead centre of everything, as far from God as it was possible to be. The heavens above the moon were the realm of perfection and permanence. Everything below the moon, including the earth, was the realm of decay, change, and death, which is why a comet, appearing to move among the perfect unchanging spheres, was so disturbing, and why the whole system was so shaken when later astronomers proved that new stars and comets appeared in the supposedly changeless heavens. Sitting over all of this was the medieval sense that the whole structure was temporary, that time itself was running toward an ending, because the dominant framework of history was not a line stretching forward indefinitely, but an arc bending toward the last judgment and the end of the world. Medieval Christians lived with a genuine and constant awareness that the world would end, that Christ would return, the dead would rise, and the entire cosmos of spheres would be rolled up like a scroll, and this expectation coloured everything, lending an urgency to the reading of comets and signs and a weight to the sense that any generation might be the last. There is a persistent modern story that Europe was gripped by mass hysteria as the year 1000 approached, crowds waiting in terror for the millennium to bring the end, but historians have largely dismantled this panic of the year 1000 as a later exaggeration, since most people of the time did not even reckon dates from a fixed year one in the way the legend requires, and the evidence for continent-wide millennial terror is thin. The truer picture is that apocalyptic expectation was not a single panic, but a constant low background hum across the entire medieval period, flaring up around wars, plagues, famines and comets, and finding endless fuel in the strange visions of the Book of Revelation. When the Black Death killed a third of Europe, many genuinely believed the end times had arrived, and movements of flagellants, men who marched from town to town whipping themselves bloody in public penance, spread across the continent in the conviction that only such extreme atonement could turn aside God's final wrath. The end was never a single predicted date that came and went. It was a horizon that travelled with them, always felt to be near, always confirmed by the next disaster, a permanent sense that the great clockwork of the spheres was winding down toward its appointed stop. And in fairness to them, they were describing something real about their world, which was fragile and violent and swept by mortality, in ways that made the end of all things feel like a reasonable forecast rather than a morbid fantasy. And so we come to the end of our long walk through the medieval mind, and it seems right to gather up what all these strange beliefs have quietly been telling us across these nights. The self-castrating beaver and the barnacle goose, the four humours and the hot iron, the splinters of the true cross and the planets blamed for the plague, the dog-headed men at the edge of the map and the king curing disease with a touch, the nested crystal spheres turned by love. None of it was the product of stupidity, and that has been the thread running through every single chapter. It was the product of intelligent, careful, sincere people, reasoning as well as anyone could from the authorities they trusted, and the evidence they could see, in a world without microscopes or printing presses or any way to check the ancient books against the actual sky. They were doing exactly what we do, trusting their experts, reasoning from their premises, and building a coherent picture of a universe they could not fully see. And they simply had worse instruments and older books. Which leaves one last thought to carry into sleep, the one this whole series has been circling. It is very easy, lying here in the age of satellites and gene sequencing, to feel a gentle superiority toward the people who buried meat to cure warts and checked the moon before opening a vein. But the honest thing to admit is that we are almost certainly just as wrong about a great many things, holding beliefs with total confidence right now that someone 1,000 years from now will find as quaint and strange as we find the screaming mandrake and the shade-giving foot. We cannot know which of our certainties are the humours of our own age, because that is precisely the point. The medieval physician could not feel the wrongness of the humours either. From the inside, a wrong worldview feels exactly like a right one. The medieval mind is not a cautionary tale about them. It is a mirror held up to the permanent human condition of doing our confident best in the dark, and the only real difference between us and the monk copying the bestiary by candlelight is which century's certainties we happen to have been handed. So that is where we'll leave it tonight, and where we'll leave this whole strange and gentle journey through the things people once knew for certain. Thank you for spending these quiet hours here, drifting off among the geese that grew on trees and the stars that moved by love. It has been a genuine pleasure to be the voice in your dark room, telling you true things about people who are doing their best. Sleep well, be a little kinder to the past than you were before, and a little humbler about the present. And whenever you need a calm voice and a strange old world to fall asleep to, you know where to find me. Good night.